Good morning, everybody, or officially, good afternoon, everybody. It's 12:01. I can say afternoon now. The popcorn in the waiting room is still happening, still people coming in. So I'm going to just give it another minute or two before we start. If you're here for the covert threat, problem gambling, and veterans, you are in the right spot. Feel free to turn on your video if you want to be in a room with us or feel like you're in a room with people. I am going to ask that everybody mutes themselves so that we aren't talking over each other, but feel free to use the chat box. And if John or when John stops for questions, feel free to unmute if you feel like that's necessary. If I mute you, please don't be offended. Feel free to unmute yourself. We have some people still coming in from the waiting room, so I'm just going to give it another minute. Okay, while people are still trickling in, I think we're going to go ahead and get started in the interest of time. Again, if you'd like to turn on your video so that you feel like you're in the room with us, that would be great. If you don't want to, I understand that. We will not be offended if you're eating lunch during the session, I promise. Thanks everybody for joining us. Welcome to the last NYCPG live webinar of 2021. We're really excited to wrap up this year with John. I will stay on at the end for anybody who has questions about how to obtain certificates or credits or CEs. I will walk you through all of that at the very end. So if anybody has those questions, feel free to stay on at the end. We have Jonathan Crandall with us here today. He is our Veterans Outreach Coordinator at NYCPG. So we're really excited. This will be the final session of our, woo, I see clapping for John, woo. This will be our final session, like I said, of 2021, and also our final session of our cultural series that we did this summer. The recording will be posted on our YouTube page. And I think there's a playlist for our cultural series, so you can check that out on our YouTube page. I'll try to get that up probably this afternoon or tomorrow. And again, I'll stay on at the end if anybody has CE questions. This is eligible for Oasis, continuing education for all of their credentials, as well as social work. No LMHC for this one. If you have questions as we go along, please put them in the chat box. If you have technical difficulties or questions, you can put those in the chat box and I will monitor that. And without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to John.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that introduction, Jamie. I greatly appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you all have had a great long weekend and a phenomenal holiday. I know I was telling Jamie before we started that I was trying to get all my yawns out of the way. Just something about coming back from a long weekend that is tiring. So I hope everyone is comfy, not comfortable enough to fall asleep on me, but we'll get started. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today we'll be talking about problem gambling as it relates to the U.S. military and veterans. So I'm employed by the New York Council on Problem Gambling as the Veteran Outreach Coordinator. The New York Council on Problem Gambling is a not-for-profit independent corporation dedicated to increasing public awareness about problem and compulsive gambling and advocating for support services and treatment for persons negatively impacted by problem gambling. Our mission is twofold. It's quite simple. We raise awareness on problem gambling and we connect those to treatment who need it. The council does maintain a neutral stance on gambling. It is not for or against it. And I must say that any opinions that I share personally are that of my own volition and do not represent the council as an agency. So today, I hope what you will learn with me is what constitutes problem gambling, learn why veterans are at a higher risk for problem gambling behavior, learn warning signs of problem gambling behavior and how to screen for such behavior, learn how to help a veteran struggling with problem gambling behavior, and understand the importance of advocacy for problem gambling awareness and increasing treatment accessibility for the veteran community. If you've taken any webinar with us, I am sure you've gone over the question, what is gambling? And it is an important question for several reasons. First, everyone has their own definition of what gambling is. And when you're working with a client that may be struggling with gambling, I find it very important to, one, define what gambling is for that client so it clears any air on what you are trying to communicate with the individual. So for the purpose of today, gambling is going to be any time we risk something of value, which is typically some form of currency such as money, at a chance of winning a reward. So that is gambling. And I'd like to share just a short story. I had a coworker that I was conversing with probably a month or two ago, and they were telling me about a conversation they had overheard. There's two individuals talking about horse betting, going to the racetrack. And one of the individuals had stated that gambling or horse betting was not for them. And the one followed up with, well, I enjoy going to the horse track, but I also enjoy going to the casino. And the individual who had just said that gambling was not for them responded by saying, blackjack is my game. I love playing blackjack at the casino. So there is a slight deviation of what gambling is between the two, right? In my opinion, blackjack is gambling. They're risking something of value at a chance of winning a reward. So when we're working with our clients, again, I find it important to define what gambling is and offering some examples, which we will cover later on when we talk about screening. But first, let's talk about the spectrum of gambling behaviors. It is linear. It is something that can go from non-gambling, which is somebody that does not participate in any form of gambling, to social gambling. And in between social and problem gambling is at-risk gambling. So I find that important to mention. Between social and problem gambling is at-risk gambling. And then after problem gambling, you have gambling disorder. The mere difference between problem gambling and a gambling disorder is a diagnosis. And more often than not, a diagnosis is completed by a DSM-5 diagnostic criteria, which, as you can see on the screen here, there are 9 criteria. There are 9 criteria for gambling disorder. An individual must meet at least 4 out of those 9 to be classified with what would be a mild level of gambling disorder. Between 4 and 5 would be mild. Between 6 and 7 would be moderate, and between 8 and 9 of any of these criteria would be considered a severe gambling disorder. And again, this is based off of the DSM-5. So now that we understand what gambling is, how we define gambling, we know the spectrum of which gambling disorder lies. It is linear. An individual can be diagnosed with a gambling disorder and then join recovery and be a non-gambler. So it is linear. And there are some important pieces of that linear spectrum between social and at-risk gambling that we'll discuss in a little bit, revolving around military and peer support. But first, let's talk about what we know so far about military and problem gambling. Just for some numbers in personal interest, in 2019, there were 718,000 veterans in New York State. And in 2018, there were 1.3 million active duty service members. You can see on the pie chart how each branch of the military makes up the military as a whole. As you can see, the Army is by far the largest branch of the service, followed by the Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and then Coast Guard. And there's one that's often forgot, but we must mention, is the Space Force, which is indeed a real thing. And it is something that is now part of our military. In 2017, the U.S. Government Accountability Office issued a report, and it was on the basis of the Department of Defense and gambling among service members. Some key items that they discussed. Many of you may not be aware. I was not aware while I was serving. I was on active duty. I was stationed here in the United States at Camp Lejeune. So I was surprised when I took on the role of Veteran Outreach Coordinator and I started to learn more about gambling in the military, that there are military bases overseas that have slot machines that are readily available for anyone to play. Talking to various veterans that have served overseas, these slot machines are abundant. They are anywhere from the enlisted or officer clubs. I've heard they're in chow halls, and they're encouraged to be played. The revenue goes to what's called MWR, or Morale, Welfare, and Recreation, which is a great service which brings concerts to the troops. It brings a lot of different forms of recreation for soldiers, Marines, airmen, and sailors. But the way that the money is being generated is causing problems, quite frankly. Now, in July of 2016, there were over 3,100 slot machines. That number doubled since the first report that the GAO did in 2001. From 2011 until 2015, those slots generated over $539 million in revenue. So that was over $100 million a year. Again, this is 6 years ago, over 6 years ago. So I'm willing to bet that these slot machines have generated more revenue. And the biggest point and most important point that this report discussed was the fact that there was a very low number of service members reporting that they had a gambling disorder or some form of problem with gambling. And they chalk this up to low rates of screening and honestly, low rates of reporting among service members. I went on Reddit a month or so ago, and there was a subreddit discussing the annual health survey or annual health assessment that the military conducts every year. And this one was done over the phone. And an individual made a post on Reddit, essentially saying that they asked if they had a gambling problem. And it goes on to say, here's what not to say. Now, there's a lot of off-color remarks, but there's some things that I wanted to highlight and share with you today. One individual said, never volunteer information. Another one, just don't share any info that you wouldn't mind going public. Here's another one that I found interesting was, I tried a cigar once, freaking once, and was truthful about it. It haunted me until I got out 8 years later. Be smart. So at times, and this is anecdotal information that I'm sharing with you, but at times during these reviews, service members will be essentially told what to say and what not to say. For instance, if this assessment was being done in person, the individual conducting it may say, have you gambled more than, and this is just hypothetical, have you gambled more than 5 times in the past year? And they'll be shaking their head no. To key the individual to say no. They don't want to raise any red flags. One issue with the military is, I don't want to say one issue, the military is about mission success, right? Mission accomplishment. So anything that may deter from mission accomplishment, essentially they don't want it to come to fruition. So if they may very well know that an individual is gambling more than 5 times per year, but they're going to say no because they don't want those red flags to pop up. They don't have to address it. And in the meantime, if somebody does get wrapped up into a bad situation, they'll address that individual when it arises, but not until it does. Therefore, they don't want anything to take away from the mission, which we'll discuss the warrior ethos here real soon. But I just wanted to make a point with just the culture of the military with these health assessments. So again, this attributes, getting back to the presentation, the low rates of reporting or the underreporting and the undiagnosis of individuals with gambling problems within the military. Now, just some statistics. Active duty military veterans are at a higher rate for problem gambling or gambling disorder than that of civilians or people that are not veterans. Now, veterans also gamble at a higher rate than the general population. A report done in 2013 showed that between 6 and 8% of service members endorsed gambling problems. And at any time during a survey within a VA facility, 2% of those would actually say that they had a lifetime, or at some point in their lifetime, they had a problem with gambling. Vietnam veterans are slightly higher than the general veteran population when it comes to gambling problems. And you can see a track record. We'll discuss Iraq and Afghanistan veterans here in a minute. But research is showing that veterans from the combat era, whether it be Vietnam, Gulf War, OEF, or Operation Enduring Freedom, or Operation Iraqi Freedom, there is a higher prevalence for those with gambling problems for reasons such as trauma, substance use disorder, and other mental health conditions, which again, we'll discuss here in a moment. Some more statistics. A survey in 2017 found that over 2% screened positive for at-risk or pathological gambling, which reflects back to that 2% lifetime prevalence for any VA facility. So the 2% is along the lines with the actual general population. That's for just individuals that are gambling. Again, combat exposure or trauma-related conditions do exacerbate the problem for veterans, to the sense that Iraq and Afghanistan veterans are over a 4% chance to exhibit at-risk or pathological gambling. Now, veterans that are seeking mental health treatment, over 10% have actually reported a lifetime history of gambling disorder. Almost half of veteran gamblers that sought treatment have reported a previous suicide attempt, almost half. Also, veteran problem gamblers have a higher risk for substance use disorder and also suicidal ideation. Now, veterans struggling with a gambling disorder along with a pain disorder, which is very common in the veteran community, pain disorder, they're almost 2 times more likely to attempt suicide compared to a veteran struggling with just a pain disorder alone. Trauma-related conditions, you mentioned this earlier. Problem gambling amongst veterans is often co-occurring with other trauma-related conditions, or mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injury, also military sexual trauma. This has something to do with positive gambling expectancies. So an individual that may be dealing with post-traumatic stress, for example, may seek gambling as a form of coping, or struggling with depression, they may seek gambling, or they may seek that reward or that potential reward from gambling as a way of coping with their depression. An interesting fact when it comes to gambling is most individuals struggling with problem gambling, they essentially get a spike of dopamine, or they get that sense of euphoria or high, for lack of better terms, from the possibility of winning or the anticipation of winning. It's not necessarily the win itself. That just validates the behavior. The anticipation is where they essentially get the euphoria generated from gambling. Now, across the board, individuals struggling with trauma and problem gambling, there are higher rates of dissociation between both the trauma-related illness and problem gambling. And here's an interesting fact. Problem gambling produces greater traumatic stress symptomology. So, for example, an individual struggling with opiate use disorder, they start out essentially achieving euphoria and an overall sense of well-being. Over time, now they're just chasing that feeling, and greater adverse effects are happening. So an individual struggling with post-traumatic stress may start gambling as a way of coping, as a way to kind of shut off those voices or thoughts or beliefs in their head. But over time, as the gambling progresses, it's actually going to trigger a greater response to a traumatic related stress concerning post-traumatic stress. Also, there's a higher physiological arousal and face of similar trauma exposure. So this essentially is the same thing that I just discussed. An individual struggling with post-traumatic stress that gets involved with a gambling disorder, they're going to essentially be, they're going to have a greater response to a similar trigger than they had prior to the problem gambling. So it's essentially exacerbating the symptoms of the post-traumatic stress. More times than not, in over 72% of the cases, post-traumatic stresses come before the gambling disorder. So there you can see individuals are utilizing gambling as a way to cope, again, as a way of either shutting off those voices or those thoughts, to isolate, to essentially get tunnel vision, and just to calm down some of that hypervigilance. Then the gambling disorder progresses. Problem gambling behavior decreased with post-traumatic stress treatment. So this is an interesting fact that actually shows some hope for veterans that are struggling with both post-traumatic stress and a gambling disorder. Is the post-traumatic stress treatment, in particular prolonged exposure therapy, actually had a benefit to decrease problem gambling behavior. Some additional causes for problem gambling behavior amongst the veteran and active duty population is low social support upon return from deployment. One would think that social support upon return from deployment would be greater than before, but we forget that essentially post-deployment is just a honeymoon phase. Everyone's happy to see you home, everyone's happy to be home, and then that fizzles out within a month or two, and everyone's back to the normal grind. The individual, the soldier or the veteran is home trying to adjust, which leads us to the link between several aspects of military experiences and problem gambling. So stress, hyperarousal during transition may send an individual or a veteran to seek gambling as a way to cope. There are experiences related to military service that have more, that cause a higher severity with problem gambling. And this is typically post-deployment. Again, social support, it dwindles down typically a month or two after the return home. Folks that were home get back to their daily grind, and veterans are stuck home essentially alone, trying to cope with what they have just dealt with, or just trying to cope with the civilian world and learning what their new career path is, learning, just how to live again, essentially. Now, lastly, less than 10% of people with gambling problems seek help. And again, this is due to shame, stigma, and misunderstanding of gambling disorder, which plays into the military culture. Warrior ethos. So part of military culture is this sense of, again, mission accomplishment. The mission always comes first. Never accept defeat. I'll never quit. Now, this warrior ethos was ingrained to essentially distract from that natural human essence of self-preservation. It's not natural to run into gunfire. It's not natural to essentially operate in an environment where there are bombs and explosives going off. But this warrior ethos, this piece of military culture is ingrained in veterans and active duty personnel to essentially get them out of that mindset, that normal mindset of self-preservation, and get into the mindset of mission accomplishment, rescue your brothers, run into the firefight and grab that fallen comrade and pull them out. And this plays into a lot of the ideals and beliefs of military. Again, I will never quit, as you can see on the tattoo on the slide. When it comes with addiction and veterans, it's hard to admit defeat. It's hard to stop trying to essentially self-medicate or help yourself. This warrior ethos plays in a lot into why people may join the military. It gives a sense of purpose. It is a form of identity. It is attributed to the morality of being in the military, that sense of belonging, that brotherhood, that team concept, honor, sacrifice. Now, this also plays in while they're in. When they get out, this warrior ethos has an effect on veterans. It prevents them from asking for help. it leaves them with the question of, how does a warrior become a veteran? How does this transition work? Transition is different for every veteran. There's no case alike. There's all different sets of circumstances, different personalities. Each transition is different for every veteran, so they're not all alike. Again, when we're talking about recovery from addiction, we need to be more of a well-rounded approach. The recovery community has been doing a great job with essentially getting out of that cookie cutter mind of thinking, and essentially treating the individual as a whole and treating everybody's recovery as their own. Suffering in silence is huge. Again, the warrior ethos, that refusal to ask for help, the shame of doing so, the pride in embracing the suck, essentially being able to sit through the worst circumstances possible and getting through the other end. Veterans, when it comes to being in a hard predicament, they pride themselves of being able to get through on their own or with little or no help. So the profile of a veteran that is struggling with gambling disorder, typically they are younger veterans. They're slightly higher at risk. That's not to say that older veterans are not. Again, we mentioned Vietnam veterans are at a higher risk than the general veteran population. It's typically male, typically a male veteran that is struggling with problem gambling. Native American, African American, Latino American, they are at a higher risk for problem gambling as veterans, and we need to do a better job in the veteran community of bringing individuals from the Native American, African American, and Latin American communities to the table. We need to do a better job of identifying the barriers that they face in getting help. Served in the Navy. Another interesting fact that I discovered is Marine Corps veterans are at higher risk for problem gambling. That's concerning for myself, not only because I'm a former Marine, but because the military, or the Marine Corps, is one of the smallest branches in the military, and they have a higher rate of problem gambling behavior. Typically, a veteran struggling with problem gambling, their primary source of medical care is through the VA. Typically, they are retired and on some sort of disability or supportive income. More times than not, single. That being either never been married or having been divorced or separated. And again, genetics, like any addiction, play a part in gambling liability or addiction. Children of gambling parents were 3 to 12 times more likely, such as a child of an alcoholic is at a higher risk of becoming an alcoholic. So that's a profile of gambling disordered veteran. So why does all of this matter? Why are we talking about this today? 2 reasons. One reason, I feel society knows well, veterans have a higher rate of suicide risk than those who did not serve. Veterans also have a higher rate of problem gambling. If you don't know, problem gambling has the highest rate of suicide out of any addiction. So when you're talking about veterans that have a higher risk for suicide than the general population, have a higher risk for gambling disorder than the general population, those two are, when they're both a concern, it's too much of a risk not to address. And most importantly, help is available. Help is available through the New York Council on Problem Gambling. Help is available through VA resources. And help is available within other states through other councils, such as the New York Council on Problem Gambling. Next, we're going to talk about some warning signs of problem gambling and the similarities to suicide, followed by screening and then treatment options that are available. Now, some warning signs for problem gambling. There are some similarities from that for suicide, such as sleep disruptions, changes in personality, loss of interest, or withdrawing from otherwise normal activities that one used to enjoy. But with problem gambling, one of the biggest warning signs is debt, or a pattern of borrowing money from other veterans, other active duty service members, other subordinates. Preoccupation with gambling. This is similar to to other addictions, right? As you can see, if we go back to that DSM-5, that criteria, the 9 criteria for a gambling disorder, one is preoccupation with gambling, very similar to other addictions, hence why gambling disorder is lumped in the DSM-5 with other addictions or substance use disorders. There are a lot of similarities between other addictions and gambling, such as preoccupation with gambling, such as tolerance or withdrawal. And why do I have problem gambling and suicide warning signs up here together? Again, problem gambling is an addiction that has the highest rate for suicide ideation and suicide attempt. Some risk factors that play into both problem gambling and suicide for veterans. Problem gambling, male, younger adults, ethnic minorities, a lower socioeconomical background, a history of substance use or a mental health disorder, trauma and grief, loneliness, boredom. If you look at all these risk factors for problem gambling, it's almost fitting of what you would see as somebody serving in the military. Take out substance use and mental health disorder, although those are common going into the military. Basically, what I want to say is not everyone that's in the military has a substance use or mental health disorder, but a lot of males join the military, younger adults, minorities, individuals from a lower economic background join the military for a variety of reasons. Loneliness and boredom. Some people join the military for a sense of purpose. Now, risk factors for suicide, social isolation. Now, we talked about the transition period for a veteran or that post-deployment period. The first month is great, the honeymoon phase, but after that, there's a lot of isolation. Again, we see substance use disorder and mental health disorder, a common factor between problem gambling and also suicide. Unemployment, financial issues, a huge risk factor when it comes to problem gambling and for suicide. Chronic pain, we already mentioned that veterans that struggle with a pain disorder and also a problem gambling disorder are at a higher risk for suicide. Disability, when we talked about the profile of the veteran that is struggling with problem gambling, most often than not, they are on a supplemental or a disability form of income. Hopelessness, barriers to treatment. Now, barriers to treatment, that's one of our objectives here today, is to essentially create more awareness of problem gambling behavior as it relates to veterans, creating that awareness so that more treatment options can become available and more screening can be done. Now, military factors, you have that competitive nature. With military comes boredom, that hurry up and wait. 15 minutes prior to 15 minutes prior. If you're in the military, you know what I'm talking about. Loneliness, there's a lot of loneliness, especially for people that are deployed or on ship. Trauma is a risk for military participation. Grief, loss of brethren, or just that loss of brotherhood upon transition out of the military. And there is a tradition of gambling. It dates far back, I want to say back into the Civil War era, amongst military and card games. It's used as a sense to break up that boredom and loneliness. And again, officer clubs, also enlistment clubs. We spoke on the slot machines that are present at overseas bases. So there are some screening tools. This was taken directly off of the New York State Oasis, the Office of Addiction and Addiction Services and Supports website. These are the Oasis approved screening tools. These are the brief screening tools that we use and discuss as a council when clinicians or individuals are looking for brief screening tools. The first one, you have the live bet tool. It's a quick 2-question test. It's a 2-item tool. It's been deemed valid and reliable for ruling out pathological gambling behaviors. If an individual answers yes to one or both questions, further assessment is indicated. Within that questionnaire, the questions are, have you ever had to lie to people important to you about how much you gambled? Or have you ever felt the need to bet more and more money? So again, a yes to either one of those questions or both would be an indicator for further assessment. You also have the National Opinion Research Center Diagnostic Screen for Gambling Disorders. The CLIP, which the CLIP is an abbreviation for loss of control, lying, and preoccupation screen. It's a quick 3-question screen derived from that National Opinion Research Center Diagnostic Screen. Along with that one, you have the PERC, which is an abbreviation for preoccupation, escape, risk relationships, and chasing screen. That's a 4-item screen. What I mean by chasing is when an individual has lost a sum of money through gambling, they continue to play in an attempt to regain that money. And then you have the BBGS, the brief biosocial gambling screen. This is one common that's used within the VA and also within the clinicians that work within the clinical networks of our problem gambling resource centers here at the New York Council on Problem Gambling. It's a 3-question brief screening instrument. It helps a person decide whether to seek more formal evaluation or treatment for their problem or their gambling behavior. So once these tools are utilized, if it is been determined that an individual needs further assessment, these screening tools are the ones that would be used to achieve that diagnostic. Again, the DSM-5 gambling disorder has been in the DSM since the DSM-3. It started out based on the criteria or the anecdotal experience of Dr. Robert Custer, who's actually a founder of the New York Council on Problem Gambling. He also developed the first inpatient gambling specific treatment center in the country. It's the oldest one in the country. It's currently at the VA in Cleveland. And again, it's based off of Dr. Robert Custer's anecdotal experience, his knowledge. That's where the DSM-3 got their diagnostic criteria, and it advanced several times to now the DSM-5. And we talked about the 9 criteria, and then it also has a severity, mild, moderate, and severe classifications for the diagnosis. You also have the NORC diagnostic screen, which is that NODS, or the National Opinion Research Center diagnostic screen. Again, it's based on the DSM-5 criteria, but not only does it assess just past year problem gambling, but also lifetime. You have the South Oaks gambling screen. The good thing I like about that is it has some revised editions for both adolescents, and it's also translated in Spanish. And then you have the Problem Gambling Severity Index. Now, when screening veterans or service members, there are some key points that I feel are important to mention of things to do and not to do. One thing, keeping politics out of it. Being mindful and curious of what branch of service. So to open up conversation, you can just say, you know, what branch of service were you in? Being open-minded, don't make assumptions. Be curious of their lives outside of the military. Many veterans don't care to talk much about their military experience. They'd rather talk about their hobbies or interests outside of the military, such as their family. Let them tell their story when they're ready. Respect the process. Along the don't questions, that one up first should be self-explanatory, but don't ask about, you know, death, if their friends have died. Don't ask if they have killed anybody. Don't ask if they've seen people die. That will naturally come out when they're ready, if they choose to tell you. Don't assume everybody was in combat. Actually, a small percentage of the military was actually in combat. And again, don't make assumptions about one's military career. Remember, the veteran is the expert. Key point is if you've dealt with a Marine in the past and you now have a new client that is a Marine, don't expect their stories to be the same. Don't assume that it's going to essentially be the same person. Everybody's military career is different. Everybody's transition out of the military is different. Some questions to ask, some questions that will help generate rapport, trust. Tell them or tell me about your military experience. Let them guide the conversation. Don't come across as essentially knowing it all. You know, if you don't know a question, ask. Just say, I don't know anything you're talking about. I don't understand that acronym. Can you please explain? I'd be more than happy to explain. One question to ask is, when and where did you serve? What unit were you with? And show genuine interest. How is your military, or how has the military or your military service affected you? That question there can lead to several other questions, providing more answers. And has anyone in your family served? A lot of veterans are from families that have long generational history in the military. So just to take a step back before we go into protective factors, to start out the presentation today, we discussed what problem gambling is, right? I provided some definitions or some examples such as horse tracks or horse betting, blackjack, casino betting. I find it important when you're screening individuals or screening veterans for problem gambling that we use the word gamble or gambling as least as possible. Provide examples of gambling. Also, gambling or gamble can be stigmatizing language, right? So if I'm working with a veteran and I want to go over the lie bet test, in that first question, have you ever had to lie to people important to you about how much you gambled? I'd probably change that end with, have you ever had to lie to people important to you about how much you have played the lottery, or how much you spend on scratch offs, or how much time you spend at the casino? Sometimes, as I discussed with the Reddit thread, you're not going to get an honest answer. That's where just being cognizant of the red flags, building that rapport and listening throughout the process of your time with that veteran and learning about them, the truth will come out. If you build that rapport with them and you build that trusting bond with them, the information will come out, and you'll be there to help them. So some protective factors that help veterans and active duty service members from gambling. Awareness and education, what we're doing today, webinars, allowing myself to come after this webinar to present to your agency, or to present to your community. There are other webinars that I have available that talk more on suicide related risk with problem gambling. I have one on military culture specifically. Another protective factor is social support. There's research out there that has shown that social support or a veteran's battle buddy, being present with them, can actually take them from at-risk gambling to social gambling. A battle buddy, a good friend, a good peer is someone that can be there and remind them and say, hey, we said we were only going to be here for an hour. It's time to go. Or, hey, you said you were only going to spend $50. I see that you just put in another $20 bill, or I see that you're going to the ATM. Let's get out of here. So again, that social support is a protective factor for a lot of veterans, especially just on the transition side. There are some great programs in place now in New York State that links individual active duty service members with peers in their community as they're transitioning to to the civilian world or civilian life. Phenomenal concept. Screening. Cannot emphasize this enough. Screening. If you remember one thing of the conversation we're having today, is the fact that when it comes to veterans and problem gambling, they are often co-occurring with other conditions, whether it be substance use disorder, suicidal ideation, mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, trauma-related conditions like PTS or post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injury. So if you're currently working with a veteran, you may be working with a veteran that's struggling with gambling. You just don't know it yet, or you just have not asked the right questions yet. Resources, providing resources to veterans, letting them know that the New York Council on Problem Gambling is passionate about helping veterans that are struggling with problem gambling. We are here to help veterans, whether it be connecting them with the VA services that are available or connecting them with one of the clinical networks within our problem gambling resource centers. We are committed to helping veterans that are struggling with problem gambling. We have become aware of the fact that veterans are at a much higher risk for problem gambling than the general population. It's something that hasn't been talked about much. It's something that just hasn't really been addressed, and we're here to address that. Clinician awareness of co-occurring conditions, we discussed that. And again, treatment trauma symptomology can, treatment for trauma symptomology can be positive or make a positive impact for problem gambling treatment. So keeping that in mind, treating the both as a whole. So essentially getting to the root of the problem, right? Like I said, more times than not, the post-traumatic stress came before the problem gambling. The problem gambling was just a way of coping, like many other addictions. I'd hate to say all, but in my opinion, treating that root cause. Why are people using? Why are people doing this behavior to cope for this? Treating that this will get to the problem. So again, addressing both issues. Some notes from the field. Let me just check the time here. I've got plenty of time. Awareness is low. One thing that I ventured out probably 6 months ago on raising awareness and doing more outreach to veterans is awareness of the problem is low. Like I said, I wasn't even aware that there were slot machines overseas. I was stationed stateside. More times than not, I was out in the field working up for deployment, or I was deployed. I was never at one of these, or I never realized I was at a base that had slot machines. But the individuals that have been stationed there will tell you these slot machines are everywhere. And again, with the health assessments, there's underreporting. So veterans are being underserved. So again, building upon the awareness of problem gambling within the community. Stigma, like I said, that warrior ethos that carries much stigma around asking for help. It's a sense of bravado in the military. Veterans don't want to be known for asking for help. God forbid if somebody's on active duty and they have a security clearance and they disclose financial issues, that's in their mindset. We have to target that stigma and give them a safe space to essentially, instead of having the military just wait for that one individual to pop up and address them and discharge them, give them the space to essentially get the help they need before it becomes a problem where they have to deal with them over here and discharge them out or offer discipline. I would much rather see soldiers get help for 6 months to a year and come back into the military and join the fight for the long haul than just get dealt with and discharged out. That doesn't do anybody any good. So again, decreasing that stigma, giving people a safe space, giving veterans a safe space to address the problem gambling behavior. Military culture, buy-in from the DoD. The DoD has to do a better job of screening. Again, they have to do a better job of letting individuals know if you have a security clearance and you're struggling with gambling, it's okay. We're here to help you. There are services available. We'll get you the help you need and we can get you back in the fight. Low rates of screening for problem gambling. Again, we discussed this. It's underreported, undiagnosed. So it's important when you're dealing with a veteran, they may have never dealt with their problem gambling behavior. It may have never come to a head in the military because it was something that they were told to not address. It was something they were told to say no to. So it didn't raise any red flags. Needs more research across the board. Problem gambling research needs to be done. There are some great researchers out there that have done the best with what they have, but we need more research, more updated research. I'd like to see more surveys, anonymous surveys brought out to veterans in New York State and just essentially see what the risk and see what the landscape is for gambling. More research, more resources, and more treatment needs to be available. Peer outreach. There are some phenomenal veteran peers out there that have recovery from problem gambling, but they are few and far between. We need to identify more veterans that have come out the other side successfully from problem gambling to help veterans. Like I said, peer support, social support is a protective factor for veterans when it comes to problem gambling behavior. Next steps. What can you do as an individual? What can you do as an agency to help the cause when it comes to problem gambling in veterans? You can increase screenings for problem gambling during routine visits and follow-up. You can complete screenings when an individual comes back from deployment or the military can prior to reenlistment. Building upon the awareness among mental health professionals who serve vets, increasing the awareness of the comorbidity behind problem gambling and other trauma-related conditions, offering education and information about gambling-related harms, providing a safe space to discuss that need for help or support, offering alternatives to gambling on base, or at program sites. That's something the problem gambling resource centers in your region can help you come up with. And then social support, again, protective against at-risk gambling. Some services that are available. Where we were, there was a time when the VA was considered not doing much to address the growing concern of problem gambling among veterans. Now they have 2 inpatient or residential problem gambling specific treatment facilities. They have one in Las Vegas, which is unfortunately only for residents of Nevada, but there is one in Cleveland, Ohio, that is for veterans across the country. The VA and outside community partners and services. One thing, veterans are often treated in substance abuse treatment programs. I feel there needs to be more gambling specific treatment programs available to essentially address problem gambling behavior. There are a lot of similarities between addictions, but I feel when it comes to treatment, they need to be addressed separately. A lot of therapists are not qualified to treat gambling disorders. When we have clinicians come aboard our clinical network with the problem gambling resource centers, they're put through an extensive training program through our training department that Jamie is part of at the New York Council on Problem Gambling. They go through extensive training on how to address problem gambling as a whole. Veterans are rarely referred to qualified non-VA providers. This is actually changing. The VA had come out with something called the Mission Act not too long ago that is encouraging non-VA providers, community partners to essentially register with the VA so that when a veteran comes to a VA that is not able to help them, they can reach out to a community provider and get them the help they need. And again, most VA mental health service lines are not aware of the fact that there are residential treatment programs available for veterans. And the VA does have a gambling website that has a wealth of knowledge on it. Now, the New York Council on Problem Gambling, again, we're a not-for-profit. We are dedicated to increasing public awareness about problem gambling, and we are dedicated to connecting individuals and their family members to treatment if they are negatively impacted by problem gambling. A little bit of history about the New York Council on Problem Gambling. Its co-founders were veterans or supporters of veterans alike. Dr. Robert Custer was the one that developed the gambling specific treatment program for veterans in Cleveland, Ohio. And then Major Dunn, or Monsieur Joseph Dunn, was a Korean War veteran. He was a chaplain. He was a paratrooper. He was awarded extensive medals for valor, such as the Silver Star, Purple Heart. He was a member of Gamblers Anonymous in New York City, and there was a time when they needed a public voice. Obviously, when you're a group in a group of anonymity, you cannot have a public speaking voice. There was a need for that, so they developed who we are today, the New York Council on Problem Gambling. It at one time was together with the National Council on Problem Gambling, which is now a separate entity in Washington, D.C., doing great work on the national level, and we are doing great work on the state level. We have a plethora of other programs that you can see on the slide, but the one in specific that I'd like to talk about today is the problem gambling resource centers that are in your region. We have a total of 7 of them. They are funded by the New York State Office of Addiction Services and Supports, and they are consisted of team leaders and program managers that are willing and available to help increase public awareness on problem gambling and connect those negatively impacted by problem gambling to the services they need. How do they do that? They distribute materials about the PGRC and problem gambling. They conduct presentations and trainings like the one today to agencies, groups, and individuals. They meet with community leaders to essentially learn about individual communities and address their readiness to address problem gambling. They also have clinical networks of licensed clinical social workers, licensed mental health counselors, and licensed marriage and family therapists that, again, go through training so they can be subject matter experts when it comes to working with an individual that is struggling with problem gambling. They can do one-on-one counseling sessions. So each region has its own number, which I'll get into how you can find that here in a minute, but they have their own number monitored by program managers. So Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, if someone calls that number, they're going to get a live person on that line that is going to be able to address the needs that the individual is desiring and connect them with a clinician if that's what they're looking for one-on-one counseling. They can connect them to Gamblers Anonymous. They can connect them to Smart Recovery. They can connect them to myself if they are a veteran, and other veteran resources that are available. And also, before I lose my train of thought, I want to bring attention to the website at the bottom, nyproblemgamblinghelp.org. If you go to that website, it'll come up with a map of New York State. You select the county that you reside in, and that will bring you to your local problem gambling resource center, where you'll have the contact information for their team leader if you would like trainings or presentations or education, or their program managers if you would like assistance on getting people help, getting connected to more resources that treat problem gambling. One more tool for your toolbox.
John,
Yep.
I put the link for the PGRCs in the chat box if anybody hasn't. We do have a couple questions when you're done. So
Okay, real quick, and I'll jump to questions. Voluntary self-exclusion, if you're not familiar with this is a way, this is another tool for your toolbox. An individual can essentially ban themselves from a casino. It's a way to assist in their recovery. If they are looking to ban themselves or self-exclude themselves from a state casino, they can go on the New York State Gaming Commission. If they're in central New York, like I am, where they are owned by the United Nations, you can go on the United Nations Gaming Commission, and they have the process to self-exclude there. If an individual is on DraftKings or FanDuel, one of those platforms, they have self-exclusion as well. It's a great tool for an individual looking to find recovery from problem gambling. Lastly, why we do what we do. There is perhaps no better group to inform, educate, and heighten awareness of a social problem affecting a community than through the work of its social work leaders, educators, and community providers. I want to thank everybody that is here today. This is why we are here. This is why we do what we do. And I will open the floor for questions. Let's see what we have.
we have a couple questions. I've been following along. I'm just going to scroll back up. If you know the person that you're working with has a Purple Heart, would it be all right to ask them about it since it might bring up someone dying, or should you wait until they bring it up?
You know, that goes back to everyone's different. If I had a good rapport with the individual, you know, if I had talked to them in the past, I don't think it would be my first time talking to them. But if I have a good rapport with them, I would say, hey, I noticed that you are a Purple Heart recipient, especially if they have it on their license plate or if they have it visible for people to see. I think that opens the door to ask questions, right? And just say, hey, I'm interested about your Purple Heart. Would you mind telling me more?
Perfect. Another one is, do veterans medical services avoid using medications that can trigger problem gambling?
Yeah, I don't know. There's research out there of the VA using medications such as naltrexone. I'd have to refer to my partners in the Albany VA. Dr. Waite, he's a phenomenal clinician that has done work. I'll ask that question. If the individual that asked the question, if you want to email me, I can get an answer to you regarding the medication and veterans with problem gambling.
I put John's email address in the comments box. If anybody else has questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. Other than that, we have a lot of thanks, John. Great presentation. Excellent, useful information as always. Valuable information. Semper Fi.
Semper Fi.
Very informative. I learned a lot. Informative and enlightening. For those who are asking if the PowerPoint will be available, I will get the PowerPoint slides from John and I will save them to the resources tab of this course page in the training center where you'll go back to your certificate. The recording will also be available on our YouTube page in the next couple of days. Does anybody else have any more questions? All right, John, thank you for joining us. Oh, wait, we have one more question. Where'd it go? Thank you so much. If the person is missing a limb, do you mention it?
I personally wouldn't. If it comes up naturally in conversation, but that's just my personal opinion. I have friends that have, but obviously I know why they are. But if it's someone, if a stranger or a coworker, I wouldn't mention it.
I wrote that question. I want to thank you so much. But I had someone come in and my little grandson was just leaving and he put his hand on the place where the person was missing their limb. And he was so gentle. And he asked him, you know, do you have heart? He has autism.
Mhm.
And the guy was so kind. And he said that, this was the sweetest person I've ever met, this little child. They have no filter. But then
Right.
as a therapist, I didn't know if I should say anything or let it come up in conversation.
I didn't mean to offend you. I just wanted to know more. I didn't want to assume.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, I will hang out if anybody has any questions about certificates or CEs or what that process looks like. And John, thank you for your presentation, and thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity, Jamie. I'll email that the PowerPoint to you here now.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.